So I'm going to talk about a program that we have in the Santa Barbara region. I'm going to also shout out and recognize Rob Hazard, who's here, for his contribution to this. A lot of the thinking and bringing this into being is in large part due to Rob. There's also Anne-Marie Parkinson. I think I saw her in the back there. Right, Anne-Marie. There's going to be a poster later today that I encourage you to go find Anne-Marie. I'm going to give a kind of a talk about the background and the thinking behind this as a conceptual framework, give you an example of a case study. But Anne-Marie really knows a lot more as the executive director of the Fire Safety Council, what's going on in the county. Oh, and these are two really sad pictures. Paradise up high and Lahaina down low. So if you have a brand new community, you're building it from scratch, you have a lot of options to make your community more survivable, right? And I've spent some time thinking about this in my extension brain, looking at what are the options for a new community if you're building it from scratch. But for many communities, we heard 20 million people, half the community is in Chaparral, which is stunning. But many communities, millions and millions of people, are already built, right, on fire prone landscapes. What do we do to actually retrofit the many different risks? And what we've come up with is this program, RWMP, affectionately known. And this is the flaming stool of resilience. Very uncomfortable place to be, right? But we've broken our thinking into three what we call domains. Maybe better words for it, but the landscape domain, the community domain, and the built environment, right? The area surrounding the WUI, the wildland interface, the people. John, this is probably intentional, right? You have a remote control and you just turn it off, right? I don't like what he's saying, I'm just going to turn it off.
There you go.
Well, I was looking for the laser.
Oh, I'm gonna shut
Right.
this. Okay.
So, and I'll explain why we kind of boiled it down into that. It's kind of to make all of these different kinds of risks tractable and a way to approach them, really. The most common tool or activity that communities use right now is a CWPP, a Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And these work well in some communities, and they don't work quite as well in others. In Chaparral, shrubland-dominated communities, they can actually be pretty divisive. They can lead to some good things, but the focus of the CWPP, and they came out of the Healthy Forest, keyword there, forest, initiative back in 2003-04. And actually, if you look at the sponsors, there's a lot of forest organizations. These are very applicable and very widely used in forests. They're where to put your fuel breaks, right? That's the number one task or the number one priority of the CWPP. They're also supposed to be collaborative, and they're supposed to say something about home hardening. But they can often also be very postage stampy, right? Different parts of the landscape, they don't necessarily communicate with each other, and often there are a plan that's done, printed off, put on a shelf, and it's an exercise so that you can go for federal funding. If you've got your CWPP as a community, you can now go for federal funding. And as I mentioned, in some shrubland-dominated landscapes, they can lead to a fair amount of controversy, really. What about all of the things other than where to put your fuel breaks, right? There's a whole bunch of different fire-related impacts that affect people living on fire-prone landscapes. You can have water supply failures during the heat of the moment at the parcel scale or at the system scale, the neighborhood scale. Similarly, power loss during events at the parcel scale and the system scale. Power line ignitions have gotten a lot of emphasis recently, especially the utilities. Evacuation failures, that's where most of the fatalities occur, right? Road networks, communication systems. Something that doesn't get a whole lot of talk is what about refuge areas, right? Which neighborhoods actually could use these and Should we talk about them? Shouldn't we map them? Home losses, obviously. This is a big can of worms, people, right? A whole bunch of different issues with people, renters versus homeowners, socioeconomic vulnerabilities, and so on. When I talk about a WUI breach, I mean fire kind of coming in from the outside, hitting the WUI. There are a bunch of different kinds of buffers around communities. One is, we're going to recognize as an agricultural buffer, native tree shaded fuel breaks, riparian areas, sometimes be higher foliar moisture and slow or stop fires, green belts, broadly defined, grazed areas. And then I've seen even in some of the fuel break designs up in Canada are talking about, instead of just having a massive fuel break, have it a First Nations kind of a use there, which is a higher foliar moisture and a potential buffer. And how to put these back on landscapes. Basically, a CWPP really doesn't touch many of these at all. And these are all different, sometimes competing, often involving a lot of trade-offs, right? And they all take money. There are some other frameworks that are trying to be exported. This is from the Central Sierra Tahoe area, these pillars of resilience. It's an attempt to take a socio-ecological or a coupled human natural systems look at the problem of fire. But again, this is very forest oriented, right? It's about forest jobs, it's about carbon sequestration in old growth forests. And so kind of shrubland landscapes are left wondering, what do we do about that? So in our landscape here, this is a shot of the Santa Barbara front country, a smaller portion of it. A couple things jumped out in looking at this. One is that most of the home losses, most of the home losses historically have kind of happened in this central area above Santa Barbara and Montecito, but you still have intact to the west and to the east this kind of greenish patchwork of agricultural buffers, right? That's the ag belt above Goleta and the ag belt above Carp Summerland. And those, for decades, have kept, in large part, fires from sweeping out of the Los Padres. I'm sure the fire breaks in yellow along the ridgeline there have done their job at times, but probably the agricultural buffers and the other green beltish, those are shown in yellow, potential buffers, have done a lot. There's also homes built in all different time periods, different building codes, right? Different socioeconomic challenges here, languages, renters versus owners. So in our part of the landscape, this is a messy but important issue. These are real people, real places, real homes. These are examples, I think they're mostly from the ag shots from Ventura. This home here, it's a well-hardened home, it has its own water. But all of the shared infrastructure that we brought up earlier still is an issue to figure out how to assess these risks. We've taken a stab at what data needs there are and what kind of risk analysis you would actually do, and what are the mitigation steps for each of the different types of risks that I talked about earlier. These are the various ones from what we're calling the built environment domain. It's largely the shared infrastructure portion of the story. The community domain, the people. Similarly, mapping out all of the not just the hazard, right? That's kind of a separate step, but mapping out all the vulnerabilities and the exposure of these different inputs for different risks. We have our primary tool is to engage them in Firewise USA. And again, Anne Marie can talk a lot about how many communities have been engaged and been recognized. In the landscape domain, all these different ideas for buffers. The two main ones that we have focused on so far are the different ag types, the orchards above town, and we have engaged in a lot of oak tree planting in different parts to try to come up with a shaded fuel break of a native tree. A very long-term activity, as you might imagine, or taking stands that are in existing locations and cleaning them up and turning them into a shaded fuel break. As a pointy-headed academic, you need some kind of a model to organize your thinking. So this is our attempt at that. Anne Marie has a much simpler triangle one, which if you think fire, you're maybe attracted to triangles, that may be a little better fit. But basically recognizing that there are 3 domains across the bottom, that there's different steps or different phases to this, a scoping phase where you actually do a lot of the data gathering and the mapping and the analysis. That has turned out to be a huge challenge of getting the data you need for all of this. Most of it doesn't exist, actually. And it turns out that that's a pretty big bottleneck. Because you want to do all this mapping and analysis and prioritization before you go into implementation, right? Anyway, scoping, implementation, and then sort of a feedback loop to do some adaptive learning and management. A little case study. This is kind of hypothetical, but it's to give an example of how this thinking might play out. The different colors are hazard analysis, right? So we have a pretty sophisticated fire hazard mapping that's already been done using localized sundowner winds and detailed fuel models and trying to come up with a ranking for the hazard that many of the things that we care about might be exposed to. The other polygons you see on here are communities, neighborhoods that we might engage and start to work with. So these dots are those communities. The size of the dots represent the number of people in those communities. The color of the dots, the darker red, means that they are exposed to higher and higher hazard on average in their communities, in their neighborhoods. And then these 2 axes, the Y is a measure of moisture, NDMI. So basically, on average, during the fire season, how moist does the vegetation tend to remain over the year in these different communities? And on the x-axis here, we have the SRA, the State Responsibility Area, Defensible Space, some of the survey results about fire-resistant roof materials. So, with a framework like this, you could start to visualize which types of communities are exposed to which kinds of risks and how you might want to think about going about allocating funds, right? This quickly becomes kind of an n-dimensional problem if you start layering on, the water supplies and the road networks and right? It becomes something very quickly that you can't visualize well. And you need a system to help understand all these trade-offs. But this is a hypothetical look at how some of this has proceeded. Again, we're actually lacking a lot of the input data for doing a lot of analyses like this. So sometimes your feasibility and your implementation is shortcut to low-hanging fruit, which is fine. But you really want, if you're going to do this in a methodological, rigorous way, you want to have all the data you need to approach it in a more organized fashion. So we have a website, rwpsantbarbara.org. Again, please go see Anne Marie and the poster when you can. And I'll also shout out the different collaborators. We have received most of the initial funding from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. But not on here is the Moore Foundation, who's recently decided to help fund the current RWP and its expansion to North County. I want to thank them. And with that, I'll say thank you.